Good morning, Bob. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Morning, Chris. It sort of feels like letter from Brighton, as it were, as a regular correspondent with you.
Well, look, I think this one's particularly interesting as we reopen, because actually we do face still some real challenges rebuilding, don't we?
We do indeed, and what I'd like to think is we've all had a lot of time to think over the last 12 months, and there's some great ideas have emerged from people thinking about the structure of the industry, the shape of the industry, the future of the industry, and the practices. And I'd like to think that as part of this sort of thinking process that I've adopted what I term Hospitality 21, a prospectus for change, on the basis that we don't go back to some of the bad old ways of the past, but we really collectively try and think about how we can improve our industry, this sector, for the future on a long-term basis.
Yeah, I mean, that's the key challenge, that we learn the lessons, isn't it? And that we don't go back to those pathways. I mean, I suppose that's the first question. Do we think that was happening? Do we think there's a momentum that people have learnt the lessons?
Well, I would like to think so, but I sometimes doubted that it's sort of almost slipping back into the familiarity of the past is the easy thing to do, and to tackle real change is almost the most difficult, because it's slightly the unknown and it's frightening. But I can tell you, the one thing we really have to do is to re-establish long-term trust for our sector, both with staff, with customers, suppliers, and society as a whole, because there's been a major shake-up in the last 12 months, and we can't take it for granted that things will just go back to the way they were. That's why I think it's so important that we re-examine these close relationships we have with our key partners for the future.
Okay, so what do you think we need to do?
Well, I think the very first thing we have to do is perhaps review some of the charges we have and how we charge our customers for our services. And I've got several areas to look at that. Whether you're in a hotel, I would like to think that bad practice like sort of advertising room charges without showing VAT really does disappear for good. In restaurants, I'd like to think compulsory service charge disappears for good. I see nothing wrong with voluntary service charge, but practices of having fixed service charge and discretionary service charge all on the same bill, I think have just got to stop forthwith. I think contract caterers have got to be more honest with clients about how they charge for their services, and there should be full disclosure and no hidden costs. So it's about establishing trust with our customers in the first instance, that what they are being charged for is the actual price, and there are no hidden costs and no hidden prices, and we're being upfront and honest. So I think that's a starting point.
This whole piece about trust, it's really about behaviours, isn't it? And actually, you're putting the customer first again, isn't it?
Well, you're absolutely right. But then if we extend that, it's not just about behaviour with our customers. It's about behaviour with our staff. It's about behaviour with suppliers, and perhaps about behaviour with society as a whole. And I've always taken the view, and I mean, I know it's a trite thing to say, but nothing are more important than the people who work for us, our staff. They're the ones who deliver the service. So perhaps, again, we can really review the relationship we have with our staff and re-establish trust there. I know a lot of companies have been extremely good during the lockdowns with staff, but that's not the case of everyone. And I think we've got to review how we engage with our staff, the contracts that they're under. Yes, it's always been the law that everyone should have a contract of employment, but I'm not sure how that's, always been the case, that we should be rewarding our staff in a fair manner now, because we have recognised how important our staff are. So no more barely paying minimum wage. Let's pay a living wage, or let's pay a living wage plus. Let's ensure that we don't have practices of young chefs in kitchens working long hours, and goodness knows what the rate of pay works out. So let's treat our staff fairly on the wage front, but more importantly, let's train and develop those staff properly. I'd like to see all new starters to any firm given, for example, 100 hours of induction training, and that should be mandatory, I think, because we're going to have a lot of new starters now coming on board with the reopening. So let's have 100 hours of induction training for all, and let's have a commitment that all companies pay 1% of their payroll costs in training and developing their staff. And I mean it, 1% of payroll costs. And we can do that by incentivizing companies that if they do meet this 1% target, they'd be exempt from the training levy. And quite frankly, if they exceed it, we have an incentive scheme that they get credited partially under national insurance rules, so that there's a real incentive to spend money on training your staff.
I mean, yeah, you came from a background that really believed in development of young talent. And actually, that's the point, isn't it? Because we haven't seen young talent have the opportunity to break through to board level, perhaps you had in your time. And the average age of directors has now gone back to 58.
Yeah, but I mean, I think, Chris, to an extent, yes, we've got to give youth a chance, but we've got to be able to keep young people in training positions to start with so that they can be developed. And that is about putting money back into people and the government supporting that through the tax system. Things have perhaps become so tight over the last 10, 15 years that we lost a lot of those developmental positions, assistant managers, development managers, and the like, so that there was almost too big a jump between junior management and a more senior level. And we seem to have lost out the last 10, 15 years a whole generation of potential management. And we've got to get back to that sort of role of having potentially assistant managers, developmental managers roles, so that we can have a conveyor belt of management coming through the system. And we have lost out on that, and that is all about putting money back into people. We can't take too much out. Perhaps we've got greedy in the last 10, 15 years and expected businesses to produce too high a profit margin. We've got to reinvest more back in the business.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. Everyone expects business just to do 20% growth or 10, 15% growth year on year, and there's no room for error or mistakes.
Well, and if you don't achieve that, they find someone else who does. I've always taken the view that, if you are a steady state business, to be growing by sort of 5% ahead of the rate of inflation is a very good growth target, quite frankly, because there's if you're in a hotel, you've got a fixed number of bedrooms. If you're in a restaurant, you've got a fixed number of covers, etc., etc. So, you cannot grow by double-digit margin, shall we say. So steady state growth over a long period of time is what we should be aiming for, not spectacular growth in 1 year by cutting costs or underinvestment. Let's look at growing our businesses in the long term and doing that by really reinvesting in our people.
Well, let's move on to the consumer, because this is an opportunity, isn't it, to really build a new message to the consumer who are coming out in their droves at the moment.
Well, I think we have to develop a number of messages to the consumer. One is, I think there will be a greater awareness with consumers that hospitality does play a key role in a local society, as I call it, for a number of reasons. Because one, it does provide jobs for local people, and that will be more the case in the future than perhaps the past. and that is recognised. So it provides jobs for local people. It's something for local people to do. There's what I term the enjoyment factor. People need to have local restaurants, local facilities, so that they can enjoy themselves locally. And of course, there is also a role in modern in the latest environmental goals that we have to achieve. Hospitality has a key role to play in that as well. So it's about our sector establishing its role in society and gaining that trust with customers that we're up for the challenge, both in employing local people, using local suppliers, providing enjoyment for local people, and meeting local environmental goals. All those things will establish trust with customers into the long term.
Now, we're going to face, obviously, a challenging time as we come out, and obviously there's a lot of forecasts about once furlough does stop eventually, that the amount of companies that will go bust, and particularly independents, which are going to be struggling. So I suppose the question is, and it's very hard if you're running a business and you're trying to get that marriage right, isn't it? But at the same time, it's equally doubly important to get it right to get the consumer through. Is that fair?
It is. I mean, it's. We can't say business is easy. Business is always tough. It always has been tough, and it will continue to be tough. And you have to take risks, and you have to take risks based on what you believe is right for your business now and for the long term. And I know the landscape is going to change. A lot of businesses will cease to exist, but there will be a lot of new opportunities for new people as well. There will be lots of job opportunities for new people. I think there will be a lot of investment available to back new businesses. So I'm afraid there will be a shakeout, and the particular shakeout will come with those businesses that have allowed themselves over the last 5-10 years to accumulate too much debt in the balance sheet. Those businesses which haven't accumulated too much debt in the balance sheet will actually be in a good position going forward. And the lesson here will always be, always operate your balance sheet in a fairly conservative way, particularly if you're a restaurant, because at the end of the day, you have very few liquid assets in a restaurant, as opposed to, at least in a hotel, you may have the property behind you. So let's get back to being slightly conservative in managing your balance sheet, recognizing that there will be changes ahead, but above all, there will be many opportunities in which we can all flourish.
So coming back, obviously you worked closely with government in the past. How do you feel government are behaving? How have they been? Have they been supportive enough?
I think, to be fair, government have actually been really quite supportive of our sector. Bearing in mind, they haven't just had to support one sector, they've had to view the whole economy. And I think hospitality has done reasonably well in gaining the recognition because of the employment issues. But one plea I would make now for the industry as a whole. I think we've seen what a great job people like Kate Nichols have done over the last year in representing the sector to government and the wider world. And I really would plead that every business should join a trade association. We really do need a strong trade association representing us to government at all levels. And I know when I was at the BHA, I used to have a joint meeting once every 2 or 3 months with about a dozen other chief executives of trade association, like the Bankers Trade Association, offshore oil, property, etc., etc. And in each of those sectors, or almost every other sector, motor manufacturing, they had almost 100% representation from members, which made their job with government so much easier. Of course, they were lucky that they didn't have tens of thousands of small companies in their sectors. But what I'm just saying, I just think for every operator, please consider hard about belonging to a trade association, because it would make it so much easier both for ourselves and for government to come to joint arrangements to our joint benefit.
Now, one of the comments that we find come out quite regularly is that everyone praises Kate and what UK hospitality has done, rightly so. However, a lot of people do feel a lot of leaders have been very absent over the last year in terms of their voice and in terms of open leadership about the way forward. Your thoughts on this?
Well, yes, and I would echo those thoughts, but I think it's a two-way street here. One is we've got to get all the companies involved in a trade association, but the trade association then in turn has to ensure that what they're doing for companies is relevant to them. And I think that's why it works both ways. So I wouldn't just criticize one side. I think we as an industry collectively have to think that we're stronger and better all together than trying to do our own thing. I think there are a few very big companies which have global reach rather than just UK reach, feel that they actually don't need anyone else. They can work by themselves and relate to government when they really have to. I have to tell them they're wrong in that approach, that governments do not like talking to individual companies for obvious reasons, because when things suddenly goes wrong, there's a deep smell about an individual company having private meetings with the government. Whereas if it's done properly through a trade association, that is acceptable. And we see at the moment, I think the whole lobbying area in government is going to come up for very close scrutiny. And it is far better done through a recognized trade association than companies trying to do it themselves through maybe an ex-prime minister or an ex-minister they may happen to know. So I think there is a lesson there for everyone at the moment. Join a trade association, give it the strength, give it the support, and in turn, the trade association must work really hard to involve all its members and keep them on board, and also work for the members' interests.
Now, coming out now, as we come out, how do you view the position of hospitality generally in people's perceptions? Can I ask?
I think in the short term, I'm relatively optimistic in that I know we're going to have a strong domestic summer because people will stay at home. I think the challenge will come later on in the year when, as I say, the summer comes to an end or the autumn comes to an end, and we then have to start looking forward to how is international travel going to resume, because for cities like London and hotspot tourism areas like sort of Bath and York and Oxford perhaps, international tourism has always been key to bringing the volumes. So I think that area I still think is uncertain. I'm not convinced myself that international tourism will resume at the level it was of maybe 2 years ago. I think there's going to be a fundamental change in particularly the older generation, how much they are prepared to travel in the way they did in the past. So that will have implications for our business.
And that will obviously knock on to pricing as well, in London, particularly of hotel rooms and things, won't it?
It will, but perhaps maybe some of the pricing might become a little bit more sensible now, so that the London market maybe has to depend more on a domestic audience than an international audience, and therefore the pricing maybe have to be more reasonable, shall we say, so that the domestic audience will take up the offers they have. Because I can assure you that you don't have to be charging £500, £600, £700 a night for a double room in central London to make a return on investment. You can have much more reasonable pricing, and maybe that will have an impact on some of the rents being charged in central London for properties, and maybe it will affect property values and even restaurant rents as well. So we might see a reduction in that to have a more realistic charging mechanism for customers.
Now, you are obviously very closely involved with a whole range of industry bodies, including the Royal Academy of Culinary Arts. Chefs have probably taken one of the biggest hits during this period of time. What do you feel? How do you see how that side of the profession is going to change?
I think, yes, they've taken a hit, but we're actually probably going to need more chefs and more UK-trained, UK-based chefs than ever before. And I just hope that we take the message through about training particularly young chefs, giving them better conditions in the kitchen. But I'd also like to tie that up with schools and colleges in that, first of all, in colleges, I'd like to think that we can resume practical training in the catering colleges, where so many colleges in the last 2, 3, 4 years have actually taken away practical training in catering courses. I think that is fundamentally wrong. So anyone doing a hospitality degree, for example, or higher qualification in the colleges, there must be an element of practical in the colleges, and I want to see that properly funded. And secondly, the level before that, in schools, I'd like to see a real input on the importance of our sector in schools, and perhaps that we give proper careers advice to all those in schools. And I'd like to see careers advice part of the Ofsted process, so that when inspectors visit schools, they can actually see that there are really qualified careers advice people in school, and it's not just a chore that one teacher does for a year, then passes on to the next person and then the next teacher. I want to see specialist careers advice people in schools so that we can really get some proper advice to 15, 16, 17-year-olds about the future they have and possibly a future in hospitality.
Now, we started, when we started this conversation, talking about service charge, because this is something you feel quite strongly about, isn't it?
I do, Chris. I am not against, if I have a great experience in a restaurant, I'd like to feel that I can reward not just the waiter, but the staff collectively who've provided me with that great experience in a restaurant. But I'd like to think it's voluntary, and it's on me as a customer feeling what a great experience I've had. I'd like to leave a little bit of something for the staff collectively to recognize the experience they've given me. So what I'm saying is, one, absolutely, it should not be compulsory. It should be voluntary. Secondly, absolutely, it should be divided up amongst all the staff, because it's not just the waiter who's given me the great experience. It's the person who's prepared the food in the kitchen, and it's even the pot wash who's actually made sure that all the cups and saucers and plates and knives and forks are perfectly clean and spotless. So I'd like the whole staff to share in that, but it's got to be voluntary, and not a fixed compulsory charge. And we really have to ensure that the wages we pay people come out of what I term the wages pot. And if customers choose to leave a service charge, that is entirely additional, voluntary and extra, and is divided up amongst all the staff.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really key piece, because we talk about trust. People never really know where service charge goes. So.
Well, exactly. I mean, I've always recommended with a few businesses that I've been involved with that you actually put a little tent card on the restaurant table or around to say that if you do leave any service charge, it goes entirely to the staff, no deductions, and end of story. So that is that establishing that trust between our customers and our industry. But I actually think we shouldn't actually have to leave tent cards. I think that should be what the rule is, so that the money doesn't disappear into an owner's pocket or to help pay for the wages. You know, staff wages should be out of the wages pot of a business, not out of service charge. End of story.
Okay.